Back on the 8th of March, when protests against the law on foreign agents erupted in Georgia, and I mean the country neighboring Russia, not the US state, the public asked, "What's wrong with this law? Moreover, such a law has existed in the United States since 1938. People started discussing that there are two versions of the law, the American version and the Russian version, which we talked about in one of our previous videos. Then I wondered, if the laws are really identical, why wouldn't they just accept the American version? Because in this case, all sorts of liberal oppositionists would have nothing to say. You wanted a pinch of Western democracy, you got it. In the end, the Georgian authorities abandoned both versions due to protests. Against the backdrop of the Georgian protests, a discussion erupted in Russian society asking, why does the US have such a law and other countries can't have it? I have also previously asked you if you wanted us to talk about the difference between the Russian version of the foreign agents law and the American one. Well, there you have it. From the previous episode, you remember that the main motive for the adoption of the Russian law on foreign agents is, why is it that the US can have it and we can't?
Why have they shielded themselves accordingly from influence from abroad and used this law for decades? And why can't we in Russia do the same?
It can all be boiled down to this point. In the US, this law was passed back in 1938. Here, look in Wikipedia, it says Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA in short. What more proof do you need? Well, let's open and look at this ancient law. You can see it on the screen. Indeed, here is 1938, here is the indication of a foreign agent, and here is a fine of $1,000, which is $21,500 in today's money. And if a person deliberately fails to register in the Register of Foreign Agents or submits false information, they can be imprisoned for up to 2 years. Well, you've got it all figured out. In the United States, the law is over 80 years old and the penalties are stricter. You know who to share this video with, and I'm the researcher. Well, that's roughly how the patriotic guardians of Russian government's decisions operate. Whatever the authorities do, it's all for the good. We, however, are going to go over the details. To begin with, the context. The year is 1938. World War II is about to begin and 3 ideologies are competing around the world: capitalism, communism, and Nazism. In the United States, a law is passed to protect them from the ideologies of unfriendly countries, in short, from propaganda. And this is not something that I have made up retroactively. It is stated directly in the explanatory note to the bill, and it is also spelled out directly in the law itself. That is, the law was introduced to prohibit the spread of alien ideas on its territory. This approach was an absolute norm for that time. The USSR also fought and tried to keep out the ideology of the bourgeoisie and cosmopolitanism. Such was the time. By the way, here is what the man himself told about the roots of foreign agents as a thing.
Этот закон придуман не нами. Мы не запрещаем работу этих организаций. Так же, как в Штатах. Только без такой жесткой регуляторики, как там. Вплоть до уголовной ответственности.
So all this time in Russia we have been told that the phrase foreign agent was invented by the states. You may be surprised because it turns out we were told a lie. In reality, the wording used there is agent of the foreign principal. It seems to be a small difference in words, but it changes the whole point. In the case of Russian law, a foreign agent is a concept in a vacuum, given at the will of the executive ministry. In modern realities, if you talk a lot and don't agree with the party in power. In the case of the states, the agent to be entered in the register is not in a vacuum and he is not foreign at all. He is just an agent that is a representative of a foreign client. And it is not the agent himself that comes to the fore, but the foreign client. In that law to which the Russian authorities are so fond of referring, first comes the definition of foreign principal and only then the agent. Agent of a foreign principal means any person who engages in public relations on behalf of a foreign entity. Yes, it is true that there is a similarity in the Russian law in that it is not clearly stated to what extent this partiality of financing from abroad, but it clearly states the connection with the foreign client, which Russia doesn't have. Here we get the first and, in fact, the key difference: the obligation to specify the customer. Russian law does not say a word about which state this person or this organization is an agent of. And based just on this fundamental difference alone, if Russia had the American version of the law in its legislation, the authorities would not be able to recognize bloggers and journalists as foreign agents who earn money from advertising. They would not be able to recognize artists and other cultural figures as foreign agents who earn money from performances. And the authorities would have to investigate each individual case of various non-profit organizations, which are more often engaged in protecting the rights of citizens, to find foreign funding and the very foreign client who determines their activities. It is simply not possible for some person in a vacuum to be anyone's agent. You can figure that out just by searching the word agent on Wikipedia. And in general, we could have ended the video on this note because this insignificant wording changes the whole essence of the laws fundamentally. But did I read scientific papers and laws for nothing? Let's make the second difference right away. Remember in the last video I talked about broad interpretations, like, in fact it was the rubber wording, regardless of the organizational and legal form, receiving money from foreign states, that was specifically tense. The state is also a very broad entity. So here it's stated in very specific terms who you mustn't get money from. Instead of just foreign states, we see government, persons domiciled abroad, and foreign organizations. Yes, that's a lot too, but there are two buts. It is still necessary to prove that the agents act precisely from and for these persons. That is, some random donations, income from some YouTube, and even more so abstract foreign influence, unlike the Russian law, are not grounds for becoming an agent. And another point, we're discussing a prehistoric law from 1938, which was already more clearly defined than the Russian modern one. And certainly, over the course of 80 years, it has changed. In general, the law has changed 12 times over 80 years. You can see its chronology on the screen. It took us 10 years to be able to turn anyone into a foreign agent. What were they doing there for a whole 80 years? Yes, if you try to mirror the Russian approach to American law over these 80 years, the states should have been able to recognize people as foreign agents for a thought crime. But it developed along a different path there. Moreover, not only did the law tighten over time during the Second World War, in some aspects it was, on the contrary, weakened. For example, in 1942, at the height of World War II, on the one hand the fine was raised from $1,000 to $10,000 and the imprisonment threshold was raised to 5 years. But at the same time, the administration of the law was transferred from the State Department to the Justice Department. The DOJ developed a practice of trying to enforce the law when there was no need to pursue prosecution. They began sending out mailings informing potential agents of the existence of FARA and their possible obligations under it. Not out of the goodness of their hearts, of course. Receiving the letter and not registering could be considered willful evasion in a court of law, if anything. However, another critical difference pops out. A potential agent of a foreign principal is first tried to be informed by letters that they should register, and an attentive viewer could have noticed this in the previous video already. The 17th of August, 2017, US Department of Justice writes a letter to Russia Today America demanding they register as a foreign agent. That is, even in modern times, even with regard to a large holding company, fully financed from the budget of a foreign country which has been noticed more than once in throwing in fakes, even this company was notified in advance. In Russia, however, people learn that they are foreign agents from the news after the Ministry of Justice sends out the lists on every Friday night.
Ковровым образом не будут агентов у нас?
Нет, ну, конечно, разве там что-то происходит ковровым образом? Посмотри, сколько их у нас? Да нет, что, каждый второй, что ли? Массовой записи иноагента у нас, по-моему, и нет.
So we got a difference, point number 3, advance notice. That's where number 4 comes in. Who registers? In the States, they get the person to register on their own. In Russia, the Ministry of Justice registers the person. By the way, the FARA wording didn't appear until 1942, and it was then that an exception was introduced. Domestic media outlets are not foreign agents if more than 80% of the company is owned by Americans and the editorial policy does not depend on a particular foreign entity. By the way, here is an interesting thing. Despite the fact that in the media it is most often positioned that FARA was adopted against Nazi propaganda, the very first criminal case was brought against 3 Soviet propagandists. In 1939, Rush, Liskin and Weinberg were found guilty for selling printed material published by the Soviet Union. And in fact, they were agents of the organization International Book of the USSR, which was controlled by the People's Commissariat for Foreign Trade, which was an organ of the Soviet government. 3 guys were fined and given sentences of several years. They were also charged with deliberate attempt to evade registration with FARA. If there are any experts on the USSR here, post in the comments what would have been done to such chaps at the time for spreading bourgeoisie propaganda. Although I decided not to knock around and went to the criminal code of the Russian SFSR. Here is what I found. In the Code of 1922, there is Article 57, where aiding the international bourgeoisie is a state offence, and Article 71, where propaganda and agitation. Now there will also be an interesting wording. Agitation in the direction of aiding the international bourgeoisie is punishable by banishment from the RSFSR or imprisonment for at least 3 years. The maximum is not set. Production, storage for the purpose of distribution of agitation literature, imprisonment not less than 1 year. In the Code of 1926, the essence remained the same, just the number of articles was slightly changed, but it still singles out bourgeoisie propaganda, which is punishable by banishment, or a minimum of 3 years of strict isolation and a minimum of 1 year for the distribution of literature. This code was in force until 1960, and later the term bourgeoisie propaganda was replaced by anti-Soviet propaganda. Distribution of literature and propaganda were merged into one article, and now any action against the current ideology was punishable by imprisonment from 6 months to 7 years, or exile from 2 to 5 years. Fun fact, in the Soviet Union there was an article in the Criminal Code for war propaganda in whatever form it took. You could get 3 to 8 years in prison for it. This was necessary to understand the context of the time and the war of ideologies. Let's return to the USA and its criminalization of the threat to the ideologies of capitalism. To give you an idea of the number of criminal cases, here are the statistics on the screen. You can see that the most cases were filed just during the Second World War, but after the end of the Second World War there is a sharp decline. If before 19 cases were filed in 6 years, then only 12 cases were filed in 20 years, and then only 2 cases in the next 20 years. Is the propaganda over? What happened? In fact, a law originally created against propaganda had begun to transform itself into a defense against lobbyism. In 1966, there was a key U-turn of the law towards not expanding, as you might think, but rather narrowing the term agent of a foreign principal. As ideological hysteria began to subside, the states shifted their focus from propaganda to processes to change US law. The amendments add this line that an agent of a foreign principal is a person who engages in political activity for or in the interests of the foreign principal. That is, it is now necessary to prove that the funds received are used solely in the interests of the foreign principal who wants to influence laws or acts. And the concept of foreign principal has been narrowed from 5 points to 3 points. In addition, the Attorney General has been given more flexibility in, pay attention here, in delisting registered agents. Here's a list of additional changes on the screen. And, well, another point is that it is forbidden to include contingency fees in contracts with agents. Simply put, these are fees for successful work. What kind of foreign agent's successful work are you talking about? To understand what exactly the US authorities are trying to protect themselves from, I will show you a good example. We need to pull up the Congressional Archives from the 50s. Page 472 describes the history of the parliamentary investigation. There was a 5% excise tax on repaired parts in the US. A committee is set up to oppose this tax that is made up of the automotive firms that pay this excise tax. The committee then hires a lobbyist lawyer, Harold Halfpenny, to push for the cancellation of the excise tax. So Harold did his job. He got the excise tax repealed, for which he was paid a fee of 10% of what the firms paid in 1947. Mr. Halfpenny received $500,000 for his lobbying work. Translated into modern dollars, that's about $7 million. This is exactly the kind of fee that was cancelled by the amendments to the Foreign Agents Registration Act in 1966. Yes, it may seem strange that we went from public enemies to lobbyists, but that is how it was now used in most cases. That was the fate of a law originally aimed at ideological propaganda which in 1966 began to focus on changing the US law. I'll point out again, the Harold Halfpenny story happened in 1947. An investigation in 1950 uncovered the details of this and other cases, and the amendments were not passed until 1966. So we get difference point number 5, the speed of change of the law. This is where this thing comes into play. Due to the large number of interest groups and the real separation of powers, key changes to the law take a very long time to be made. It's clear that there were many more stories like Halfpenny's. Even the same page of the Congress archives describes other stories. But the specific trigger for shifting the focus of the law from propagandists to lobbyists was a very specific event. The DOJ's website explicitly says the catalyst was the sugar quota excesses. What the hell?
Imperial sugar is quick dissolving, imperial sugar is fine grained.
There could be a separate video on the sugar quota mess, but who would be interested in that? Let's just cut to the chase. The United States issued quotas, that is, norms for the purchase of sugar from different countries. That is, the state decided to buy X ton from Mexico, Y ton from China, and Z ton from Cuba, and so on for many countries. And so, in 1962, Kennedy launched a trade war with Fidel Castro, rolling out sanctions on exports and imports of goods to
reduce the capacity of the Castro regime, intimately linked with the Sino-Soviet bloc, to engage in acts of aggression, subversion, or other activities endangering the security of the US and other nations of the hemisphere.
We have heard this somewhere, but we are interested in sugar in this story. And you have already guessed that since Cuba's piece of the quota pie became no one's, the other countries started to split it. I even found an article from the Duke University Law Journal in which the esteemed folks dashed off 12 pages under the heading Lobbying by Foreign Governments on the Sugar Act Amendments. Here they give a list of 10 lobbyists who fought for the pie: Mexico, China, Nicaragua, Fiji Islands, and others. As a result, there have been some wild acts of corruption. There have been some irrational decisions. Firstly, new quotas have been given to countries on the other side of the world: Australia, Fiji Islands, India, and Mauritius, which, as if in case of emergency, will not be able to deliver sugar quickly. Secondly, Senator Fulbright described various other, probably corrupt gags. Panama can only export 5,000 tons, but was given a quota of 15,000. Guatemala was given a quota of 20,000 while it met only half of last year's quota, even though it was smaller. And other similar stories. And in closing, the conclusion.
It is possible that the lobbyists overreached themselves in 1962 and that the future will not be kind to them. Even before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee began its formal hearings into their activities, its staff produced a report pressing the Department of Justice to tighten up the enforcement of existing legislation affecting foreign agents. The Fulbright investigation will doubtless result in more meticulous enforcement of existing laws regulating foreign lobbyists.
And it did. 3 years later, the law introduces clarifications on political activity for or in favor of a foreign principal. And while in the previous video I lamented that the Russian law did not specify the wording of political activity, here it appeared in 1966 already. They formulated that any activity including propaganda that influences an official of the United States or a section of the public that results in the formulating, adopting, and changing of domestic or foreign policies of the United States. Which official was influenced by all Russian foreign agents' artists in favor of which foreign government human rights organizations hypnotized the people remains unknown. Another eye-catching point is this monolith of text, which, according to the law, all those recognized as foreign agents must mark their materials up. And the rest of us must necessarily indicate that they are a foreign agent when reposting stuff about them. So in the US there is a similar clause on mandatory labeling. That's what the Russian authorities have been telling the people.
The requirement of mandatory labeling of information created by an organization performing the functions as a foreign agent is not new to Russian law. The possibility of recognizing individuals as foreign agents was provided for us in the US Foreign Agents Registration Act.
As you may recall from last episode, Russia Today America was recognized as an agent of a foreign principal. We go to the site, but no text monolith is visible. Poke through the articles, also nothing. Scroll down the page, find the tab About Us, and it seems, oh yes, here at the very bottom it indicates that the media is financed from the budget of the Russian Federation. The thing is, yes, there is a labeling requirement, but it's much simpler than Russia's. There's no obligation to write it in caps next to the title. The label itself is smaller, changing it is allowed, and yes, they explicitly tell that in general you can stick it in the About Us page. Social media is subject to this rule too. That's what agents of foreign principals do. There is no requirement to label each post separately. Here you see another major Chinese-funded media outlet recognized as a foreign agent. There is only one case where you need to label it at the beginning of the letter, if the mailing is made by text messaging. It's important to say that the fines in the US law are much harsher. It extends all the way to getting imprisoned, except the circumstances are different and the demands are different. You add it once to one of your pages and that's it. You don't have to put this nonsense in every post. And another important clarification, the labeling applies only to messages that are broadcast in favor of the foreign principal. That is, even if a private person is recognized as an agent, they're not obliged to label every message on their personal blog with kitties with this block of text. Russian law does not specify the very same foreign principal, which means it is impossible to separate agents' information from non-agents' information. So the authorities decided to make it simple. You have to label all messages on the internet. This follows directly from the construction of the laws. You can see Russian labeling requirement is much broader, requiring every text on the internet to be labeled, and most importantly, it intrudes into our privacy. But here, it is fair to note that many Russian foreign agents do not comply with this rule for several reasons. Small fines for individuals. They are not economically and physically connected to Russia, especially after the 24th of February. Or they simply consider it absurd to label posts in their personal Instagram accounts, and the enforcement is not yet on the assembly line. But here comes another characteristic: manual operation.
You and I are enabling the Ministry of Justice to take targeted retaliatory action. That is the idea behind this law.
In general, the purpose of the law is to give authorities a wide margin for maneuver. It is not the general rules that come to the fore, but the concepts. Well, it's like, if you talk too much, we'll suffocate you. That's what the MOJ is generally explicit about, why they recognized almost twice as many foreign agents in 2022 as they did in 2021. They were discrediting what's going on in the country, you see. And the Federal Service for Supervision of Mass Media happily reports that in 2022 it drew up 3 times as many administrative protocols as the year before, and the courts imposed 225 million rubles more in fines, which is about $2.3 million. Add to this the announcement of the expansion of the law on third parties and…
In terms of income, it seems fair to me. We have so far deprived foreign agents of public funding. Why shouldn't they be deprived of financing and the ability to make money at all?
There was a lot of information in this video, and believe me, there's still a lot that hasn't been said. For example, I had to read this monograph written by a dude from the Russian Academy of Sciences back in 2015. Actually, thanks to his work, I learned the connection between the US law and lobbyism, and, in general, I studied what lobbyism is while preparing the episode. Well, if you've made it to this point, let's summarize the differences. First, connection with the foreign principal. In the US, it is obligatory to have one in order to become a foreign agent. In Russia, it is not mentioned at all, which completely changes the meaning of the law in its application. In general, we can already say here that these are 2 different laws in essence. The second follows from the first. By the design of the law itself, in Russia they can recognize anyone as a foreign agent. Third, in the US you can be informed to register or to prepare a justification why you do not meet the criteria of an agent. I remind you that even Russia today registered only 3 months after the official notification by the US Department of Justice. Fourth, again derived from the previous one. In the United States, the obligation to register lies with the individuals themselves. In Russia, the Ministry of Justice unilaterally registers foreign agents. Fifth, If US government agencies have recognized the signs of a foreign agent in somebody, they will state the reason in their notification. Again, we can recall the case of Russia today. There, it was immediately stated that it was controlled from abroad. Plus, there was a large letter on 10 pages explaining who was related to whom. And if the registration is self-initiated, the reason is also described in each questionnaire. For example, the British Embassy commissioned a brief report on the sentiments of different professional groups regarding the Enablers Act that did not pass. There's even a rather funny guy who is a massive lobbyist for organizations from Morocco, Qatar and Kuwait. In general, when we randomly opened the registries, our sample included most of the people who had had contact with US officials in one way or another, which by law is lobbying contact. In Russia, only recently the Ministry of Justice in some cases started to add comments describing the reasons for the addition, and not even in the register, but in its press release. Difference number 6. Transparent registry. I'll remind you the Russian Registry of Foreign Agents is a PDF file that simply states that Ivan became a foreign agent under so-and-so law. In the US, the register is interactive, where you can set up different filters, for example, filter by foreign principles, and each agent has links to a document with a reasoning. There is also a questionnaire for each agent, which contains all the information. In fact, I showed you these questionnaires. You can go and look at them yourself. In general, it seems that, compared to the US law, the task of Russian law is to disguise the reason for its use and create a pain in the ass for a person in their ordinary life. Labeling, again, confirms this. Russia has it required in capital letters in every post on social media, even in personal ones on Instagram, which is recognized as an extremist social network in Russia, in case you didn't know. While in the US, a simple caption in the About Us page in profile accounts is sufficient. Russian law has only expanded throughout its history, while in the US it has been modified, expanded somewhere and narrowed somewhere. And amendments to the law were made during the conflict of several groups and over several years. In Russia, if the State Duma passes a law, it is literally weeks before the president signs it. One last thing. If before Russians used to brag because
Так же, как в Штатах, только без такой жесткой регуляторики, как там, вплоть до уголовной ответственности.
Then since the end of last year they can no longer brag about that. After all, they have also introduced criminal liability. And then there is the upcoming introduction of the notion of third parties who willy-nilly helped the foreign agent. Well, that's kind of it. You'd think the US introduced the Foreign Agents Act in 1938. Well, yes, they did, but as they say, there is a nuance. At the same time, although the law mostly concerns lobbyists, there is selective application. For example, the Chinese media was recognized as a foreign agent. Russia Today was recognized as well after the hysteria of the Russian trace in the election of Trump. But BBC was not. Or here's a senator not happy with why a media outlet from Qatar, registered in the US, doesn't register as a foreign agent. So there are certainly questions about the US law too, but they seem a pittance compared to the rubber-stamped and omnivorous Russian version, which does nothing but toughen up. At the same time, I think it is fundamentally wrong to call it the Russian version. The US law is aimed primarily at foreign principals and the activities of executors on their behalf. Russian law throws out the position of the principal altogether and is aimed at its own citizens. This whole situation was summarized very well by our viewer on a Russian channel. On the one hand, the authorities say that all of Sodom and Gomorrah comes from the United States. But on the other hand, Russia takes the most ambiguous things from the US and manages to twist them to the point of complete perversion. You know who to share this video with. We say a big thank you for all the supporters from our Patreon. And I'm the researcher.